At dinner, my daughter-in-law said, "Your voice is annoying. Go eat in your room." I obeyed and ate while crying in silence. The next day, I canceled the loan for her business. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." Chapter 1. The Humiliation. My name is Ramona, and I'm 67 years old. Last Tuesday night, my daughter-in-law said something that shattered what was left of my dignity. "Your voice is irritating. Go eat in your room." I was sitting at my own dining table, the one Harold and I bought 43 years ago when we first moved into this house. The same table where I'd served thousands of meals, where I'd helped Darren with his homework, where I'd celebrated birthdays and holidays. But that night, in front of my 34-year-old son and his wife Lennox, I became nothing more than an unwanted guest. Darren didn't say a word. He just kept cutting his steak, avoiding my eyes like he always did when Lennox decided to put me in my place. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, until I finally pushed back my chair. "Of course," I whispered, picking up my plate with hands that trembled more from hurt than age. I'll finish eating upstairs." Lennox smiled, that cold, satisfied smile she wore whenever she won one of these little battles. "Thanks, Ramona. We just need some quiet time to discuss business." Business. The irony wasn't lost on me, though she had no idea why. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, each step heavier than the last. The plate felt like it weighed 100 pounds in my hands. Behind me, I could hear them talking in low voices, probably planning their next vacation or discussing the expansion of Lennox's cosmetics company that had been struggling to find the right investors. I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to eat, but the meatloaf I'd spent 2 hours preparing tasted like cardboard. The tears came slowly at first, then in waves that shook my shoulders. This wasn't the first time Lennox had dismissed me like a child, but something about tonight felt different, final. For 3 years, ever since Darren married her, I'd been walking on eggshells in my own home. Lennox had moved in 6 months after their wedding, claiming they needed to save money for their future. What she really wanted was control, and she'd gotten it by turning my son against me one small comment at a time. "Your mother hovers too much," she'd tell him. "She treats you like you're still 12. Or, Ramona always has to be the center of attention, doesn't she?" Each poisonous whisper delivered with that sweet smile that made Darren think she was just being honest. I used to fight back, gently. I'd try to explain myself, defend my actions, prove that I wasn't the interfering mother-in-law she painted me as, but every attempt only made things worse. Darren would get frustrated, asking why I couldn't just get along with his wife, why I had to make everything difficult. So I stopped fighting. I started apologizing instead, for cooking his favorite meals without asking Lennox first, for mentioning his childhood stories, for existing in my own home in ways that apparently inconvenienced her. Harold would be rolling in his grave if he could see how I let them treat me. My husband never backed down from anyone, never let people walk over him, but Harold had never had to choose between his dignity and losing his only child. After Darren's father died 8 years ago, he became everything to me. My whole world narrowed down to making sure he was happy, healthy, successful. When he brought Lennox home, I was so grateful he'd found someone to love. I would have welcomed anyone who made my son smile. I just never expected her to see me as competition. The worst part wasn't even the daily humiliations. It was watching my relationship with Darren crumble piece by piece. The son who used to call me 3 times a week now barely managed a conversation that lasted 5 minutes. The boy who used to ask my advice about everything now treated my opinions like they were worth less than nothing. Sitting there in my bedroom, eating alone while they enjoyed their quiet business discussion downstairs, I made a decision. I was tired of being invisible in my own life. What Lennox didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I held more power than she could ever imagine. The next morning I called my lawyer, not because I was planning anything drastic, but because Harold had always told me to review our financial arrangements annually. It was something I'd been putting off since his death, partly from grief and partly because numbers had always been his domain. "Mrs. Morrison," Robert Chen said as I settled into the leather chair across from his desk, "I'm glad you finally came in. There are some matters regarding the Montgomery Trust that require your attention. The Montgomery Trust. Harold had set it up years ago, named after his grandfather who'd started the family construction business. I'd signed papers when Harold created it, but honestly, I'd never paid much attention to the details. Harold handled the investments, and I handled everything else. What exactly needs my attention? I asked, accepting the thick folder Robert handed me. Well, you're the sole trustee now, which means all investment decisions go through you. The trust has been performing exceptionally well, currently valued at approximately $2.8 million. I nearly dropped the folder. I'm sorry, how much? Robert smiled patiently. $2.8 million. Your husband was quite shrewd with his investments. The trust has been generating substantial returns, and according to his instructions, those returns have been funding various, let's call them family investments. My heart started beating faster. What kind of family investments? Robert flipped through another file. Monthly transfers to Luminous Beauty LLC. That's your daughter-in-law's company, I believe. The trust has provided approximately $180,000 in startup capital over the past 18 months, plus ongoing operational funding of $15,000 per month. The room seemed to tilt. Lennox's cosmetics company, the one she was always bragging about building from nothing, the one she claimed was struggling to find investors, it was being funded by my husband's money that was now under my control. Does my son know about this? I managed to ask. According to Harold's notes, the funding was meant to remain anonymous. He felt it was important for the business to succeed on its own merits, without the family feeling obligated. Harold, even in death, had been trying to protect Darren's pride and Lennox's independence. What he hadn't anticipated was how they'd treat the wife he'd left behind. What other investments are there? I asked, my voice barely steady. Robert consulted his files again. Let's see. There's the mortgage assistance program that's been covering the property taxes and maintenance on this house and the vacation cottage in Lake Tahoe. About $4,000 monthly. Then there's the education fund, which paid for your son's MBA program and is currently covering his wife's business certification courses. Each revelation hit me like a physical blow. Every comfort they enjoyed, every opportunity they'd seized, every success they celebrated, it was all built on Harold's legacy, on money that was legally mine to control. Robert, I said slowly, what would happen if I decided to redirect these investments? He raised an eyebrow. That's entirely your prerogative as trustee. You can allocate the funds however you see fit, as long as it aligns with the trust's charitable and family support objectives. And if I chose to withdraw support from certain underperforming investments? Again, that's your decision. Though I would recommend giving 30 days notice for any major changes, simply for practical purposes. I sat in that office for another hour, learning about account numbers and investment strategies and legal responsibilities I'd never known I had. Harold had built an empire in silence, and now it was mine. When I drove home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Power. Not the cruel, manipulative power that Lennox wielded, but the quiet strength that comes from finally understanding your worth. Darren's car was in the driveway when I pulled up. Through the kitchen window, I could see him and Lennox at the table, laptops open, papers spread everywhere. They were probably working on another business plan, another strategy to take Luminous Beauty to the next level. If only they knew that their entire foundation was built on the generosity of the woman they'd just banished to eat dinner in her bedroom. I walked into the house, past their intense business meeting, and climbed the stairs to my room. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't tiptoeing through my own home. I was planning. That night, as I lay in bed listening to them celebrate some minor business victory downstairs, I made my decision. Harold had tried to help them while protecting their pride. But Harold had never been humiliated at his own dinner table. It was time they learned exactly who they'd been taking for granted. I waited exactly 1 week before making my first move. 7 days of watching Lennox parade around the house like she owned it, making snide comments about my cooking, my clothes, my old-fashioned way of doing things. 7 days of Darren nodding along like a bobblehead, agreeing with whatever kept peace in his marriage. On Thursday morning, I called Robert Chen again. I want to discontinue funding for Luminous Beauty LLC, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Effective immediately. Are you certain, Mrs. Morrison? This will likely cause significant financial strain for the business. I'm certain. Please also suspend the monthly property assistance payments. I'll be handling those expenses myself going forward. The truth was, I could easily afford the property taxes and maintenance from my own Social Security and Harold's pension. The trust had been unnecessary padding, making life comfortable for people who couldn't even show me basic respect. Robert processed the paperwork over the phone. By noon, the automatic transfers were canceled. Luminous Beauty's safety net had just disappeared, and they had no idea. I spent the rest of the day doing what I always did, cleaning, cooking, pretending to be the harmless old woman they thought I was. But inside, I felt alive in a way I hadn't experienced since Harold died. Friday brought the first sign of trouble. Lennox was on the phone in the kitchen, her voice tight with stress. What do you mean the investor pulled out? We had an agreement. She paced by the window, one manicured hand gesturing wildly. No, I don't understand. Everything was approved last month. I continued folding laundry at the kitchen table, invisible as always. Lennox barely glanced at me as she argued with whoever was on the other end of the call. Find out what happened, she snapped, before hanging up. Then she noticed me sitting there. Ramona, did you hear any of that? I looked up innocently. I'm sorry, dear. I was concentrating on getting these stains out of Darren's shirts. Is everything all right? She studied my face for a moment, then shook her head. Just business problems. Nothing for you to worry about. Nothing for me to worry about. If only she knew. By Monday, the panic had set in. I could hear Lennox on the phone constantly, calling banks, investors, anyone who might explain why her funding had suddenly dried up. She'd slam down the phone and march around the house, muttering about incompetent financial advisors and unreliable partners. Darren came home from work that evening, looking exhausted. Over dinner, which I served at the dining room table, though neither of them invited me to join them this time, I could hear their tense conversation. The bank says someone requested a review of our business accounts, Lennox said, stabbing at her salad. They won't tell me who, but now everything is frozen pending some investigation. Investigation of what? Darren asked. We haven't done anything wrong. I know that, but apparently someone raised questions about our funding sources. They want documentation for every deposit over the past 2 years. I almost smiled. Robert had warned me this might happen. When large monthly transfers suddenly stop, banks tend to notice. Especially when those transfers had been coming from a trust account with charitable tax benefits. Maybe Mom knows something, Darren said suddenly. She's always been good with financial stuff. Lennox let out a bitter laugh. Your mother, Darren, she barely understands how to use an ATM. What could she possibly know about business funding? From the kitchen doorway, I watched my son's face fall. Even he was starting to see how little his wife thought of his family, of me. I just thought, she might have some ideas, he said quietly. The only idea your mother has is how to make everything about herself, Lennox replied. Remember last week when she tried to monopolize our business dinner? Thank God I sent her upstairs before she could embarrass us in front of important people. Important people. She was talking about the evening she'd humiliated me. But in her version, I was the problem. I was the embarrassment. Darren didn't argue, but I caught him glancing toward the kitchen with something that might have been guilt. That night, I lay in bed listening to them fight. Their voices carried through the thin walls, growing louder as their stress increased. This doesn't make sense, Darren kept saying. Money doesn't just disappear. Someone has to know something. Well, it wasn't your precious mother, Lennox shot back. She can barely balance a checkbook, let alone interfere with business investments. Can barely balance a checkbook. The woman who'd been secretly funding their entire lifestyle for 2 years couldn't balance a checkbook. I pulled Harold's pillow closer and smiled in the darkness. They thought I was helpless, invisible, irrelevant. They had no idea they'd been living off my generosity while treating me like a burden, but they were about to learn. Every comfort they'd taken for granted, every opportunity they'd assumed would always be there, every dollar they'd spent without thinking. It had all come from the woman they'd just dismissed as too stupid to understand business. The woman they'd told to eat in her room like a punished child. Tomorrow, I decided, I'd give them something real to worry about. 2 weeks after cutting their funding, I watched my daughter-in-law transform from a confident businesswoman into something desperate and sharp-edged. The mask she'd worn for 3 years was finally slipping, and what lay underneath wasn't pretty. It started with small things. Lennox snapping at the grocery store clerk when her credit card was declined. Her voice getting shriller when she talked to clients on the phone. The way she'd stare at me across the dinner table, as if she could somehow read the secrets behind my face. "Your mother's been acting strange," she told Darren one evening as I prepared their coffee. They were sitting in the living room, but sound carried in this old house. "Haven't you noticed?" Darren sighed. "Strange how?" "I don't know. Different, like she's watching us. Mom's always been observant. Dad used to say she never missed anything. This is different, Darren. Yesterday I caught her going through the mail before I could get to it, and she's been asking weird questions about my business meetings. I hadn't been going through their mail or asking about meetings, but paranoia was making Lennox see threats everywhere. The truth was simpler. I'd stopped flinching when she raised her voice. I'd stopped apologizing for taking up space in my own home. When someone's been invisible for years, even small changes feel dramatic. But Lennox was right about one thing. I was different. For the first time since Harold died, I had a purpose beyond just surviving each day. The real crisis hit during their 3rd week without funding. Lennox had been scrambling to find new investors, but legitimate business people ask hard questions. Questions like, "Where was your initial capital coming from?" And, "Can you provide references from previous investors?" Questions Lennox couldn't answer because she'd never known the money was coming from Harold's trust. I was washing dishes when I heard her on the phone with someone she thought might save her company. "I understand you need documentation," she was saying, her voice tight with forced pleasantness. "But our previous investor preferred to remain anonymous. It was all handled through intermediaries." A pause. Then, "No, I don't have contact information for the intermediaries. Everything was arranged through family connections." Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice had lost all its artificial sweetness. "What do you mean that sounds irregular? This is a legitimate business with real products and real customers." The conversation ended badly. I could tell from the way she slammed the phone down and immediately started dialing another number. That evening, she cornered Darren in their bedroom. I was in the hallway bathroom, but their voices carried through the thin walls. "We need to ask your mother for a loan," Lennox said. "A loan? Mom doesn't have that kind of money. How do you know? She's been living in this house for 40 years. Your father worked in construction management. They must have savings." "Lennox, Mom lives on Social Security and Dad's pension. She clips coupons and shops at thrift stores. Then we'll ask her to co-sign for a business loan. Banks trust older homeowners." I gripped the bathroom sink, feeling a cold fury settle in my chest. After 3 years of treating me like an unwanted houseguest, after telling me my voice was irritating, after countless small humiliations and dismissals, now they wanted to use my credit, my reputation, my home as collateral for their failing business. The business that had been thriving on my money all along. "I don't know," Darren said. "Mom's been through a lot since Dad died. I don't want to stress her out with business problems." "Stress her out?" "Darren, this is our future we're talking about. Our life together. If Luminous Beauty fails, we lose everything. Maybe we could move out, get our own place. Take some pressure off Mom and reduce our expenses." "Move out?" Lennox's voice rose to a near shriek. "This house is perfect for entertaining clients. The address alone opens doors for us. And your mother loves having us here. We're doing her a favor by keeping her company." "A favor? Living in my house, eating my food, dismissing me from my own dinner table. All favors they were doing for poor, lonely me." I finished in the bathroom and walked quietly to my bedroom, but I could still hear Lennox working on Darren, wearing down his resistance the way she always did. "She owes us this much," Lennox was saying. "After everything we've sacrificed to take care of her, Do you know how many social events I've had to turn down because I couldn't leave her alone? How many business dinners we've hosted here instead of going out because someone needs to keep an eye on her? Each lie was a small stab, but I'd grown immune to the pain. What struck me instead was how easily Darren was starting to believe her version of reality. The version where they were my caretakers, sacrificing their independence to look after a helpless old woman. By morning, Darren had been convinced. He knocked on my bedroom door while I was getting dressed, something he hadn't done in months. "Mom, can we talk?" I opened the door to find my son looking uncomfortable, the way he used to when he was 12 and had broken something valuable. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" "It's about Lennox's business. They're going through a rough patch, and we were wondering. We thought maybe you might be able to help." "Help how?" "Well, if you could co-sign for a small business loan, just temporary, until they get back on their feet." I looked into my son's eyes and saw the little boy who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers. The same little boy who was now asking me to risk my home to save the business I'd already been secretly funding for 2 years. "How much are we talking about?" I asked gently. "Maybe 50,000? 60 at the most." Such a small amount compared to what I'd already given them. But they didn't know that, and their ignorance had become my power. "Let me think about it," I said. "This is a big decision." Darren's face lit up with relief. "Really? You'll consider it?" "I'll consider it." But what I was really considering was how far I was willing to let them fall before I decided whether to catch them. I told them I needed a week to consider the loan. What I really needed was time to gather information that would change everything. On Wednesday morning, while Darren was at work and Lennox was at what she called a crucial client meeting, I drove to the small coffee shop downtown where I'd arranged to meet someone who'd been watching my family's situation with growing concern. Margaret Chen, Robert's wife, had been Harold's secretary for 15 years before he retired. She'd helped him set up the Montgomery Trust, and she'd kept in touch with me after his death, checking in periodically to see how I was managing. "Ramona," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. "You look better than you have in months." "I feel better," I admitted, "though I'm not sure that's going to last." Margaret had called me 2 days earlier with information she felt I needed to hear, information about Lennox that explained so much about the past 3 years. "Tell me what you found," I said, gripping my coffee cup like an anchor. Margaret pulled out a folder, glancing around to make sure we couldn't be overheard. "I wasn't sure whether to share this, but after what you told me about how they've been treating you." She opened the folder to reveal printed emails, bank statements, and what looked like court documents. "Lennox wasn't entirely honest about her background when she married Darren," Margaret said carefully. "This isn't her first marriage." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "She was married before, to a man named Richard Hartwell. Wealthy family, owned several car dealerships in Connecticut. The marriage lasted 2 years. Margaret showed me a newspaper clipping from a Connecticut paper, dated 4 years ago. The headline read, "Local businessman granted restraining order against ex-wife." According to the court records, Lennox had moved in with Richard's elderly mother after their wedding. Within 6 months, she'd convinced Richard that his mother was becoming senile and needed to be moved to a care facility. She took control of the household finances and started isolating the older woman from friends and family. I felt cold despite the warm coffee shop. "What happened?" Richard's mother tried to warn him, but Lennox was very skilled at making her complaints sound like the ramblings of a confused old woman. It wasn't until Richard discovered that $50,000 had been transferred from his mother's account to a business Lennox had started that he began investigating. Margaret turned the page to show me bank statements. Lennox had been slowly draining his mother's savings while convincing Richard that the money was going toward the old woman's care. When he confronted her, she claimed his mother had given her permission, said the old woman was grateful for all of Lennox's help and wanted to support her business ventures. The parallels to my own situation were chilling. Did Richard believe her? At first. But then his mother had a lucid moment in front of witnesses and made it clear she'd never authorized any transfers. Lennox had been forging her signature on documents. I stared at the papers, seeing my own future written in another family's tragedy. What happened to the mother? She died 6 months later. Heart attack. Brought on by the stress of everything. Richard blamed himself for not listening to her sooner. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. He told me he'd give anything to warn other families about Lennox's pattern. Pattern? Richard did some research after their divorce. Lennox has a history of targeting men with elderly mothers or sick relatives. She presents herself as the perfect caregiver, moves into the household, then slowly takes control while isolating the vulnerable family members. I thought about how quickly Lennox had moved into our house after marrying Darren, how she'd gradually convinced him that I was becoming a burden, that my opinions didn't matter, that I was just a lonely old woman who needed to be managed rather than respected. There's more, Margaret said quietly. Lennox is currently having an affair. The words hit me like a physical blow. With who? A man named Trevor Walsh. He's a business consultant she hired 6 months ago. They've been meeting at the Marriott downtown every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. Margaret showed me hotel receipts, credit card statements, even photos taken by Richard's private investigator, who'd been keeping tabs on his ex-wife. She's using money from her business, your money really, to fund these hotel meetings. The business consulting fees she's been paying him? They're about 3 times the normal rate, and most of their meetings happen in hotel rooms, not offices. I stared at the evidence, feeling a strange mix of rage and relief. Rage at the betrayal, but relief that I finally understood what I was dealing with. Lennox wasn't just a difficult daughter-in-law. She was a predator who'd chosen my family as her next target. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Because Richard wanted you to know. He said he's watched this pattern destroy 3 families now, and he can't stand by and let it happen again. He's willing to testify if you need him to." I gathered the papers, my hands surprisingly steady. "What does he think I should do?" "He thinks you should protect yourself and your son before it's too late. But he also thinks—" Margaret hesitated. "He thinks Lennox has gotten careless this time. She's used to dealing with confused elderly people and weak-willed sons. She's not used to dealing with someone who has the resources and intelligence to fight back." I left that coffee shop feeling like I'd been handed a weapon I didn't know I needed. But I also knew that having information and knowing how to use it were 2 very different things. That evening, I sat in my bedroom and called Darren's cell phone. "Mom, is everything okay? You never call my cell. I need you to come home early tomorrow. There's something important we need to discuss about the loan." "Of course. Should Lennox be there too?" I looked at the folder of evidence sitting on my nightstand. "Actually, I'd prefer to talk to you alone first, just to make sure I understand all the details." "Sure, Mom, whatever you need." But what I needed was for my son to finally see the truth about the woman he'd married, and tomorrow, I was going to make sure he couldn't ignore it anymore. Darren came home early Thursday afternoon, finding me in the kitchen making his favorite cookies. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to rush home from school to tell me about his day. "Something smells amazing," he said, settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble for our talk. It's no trouble. We need to have a serious conversation, and these discussions always go better with comfort food." I poured him a glass of milk and set a plate of warm cookies between us, just like I had when he was young and we needed to talk about difficult things. "Mom, about the loan," he started, but I held up my hand. "Before we discuss any loan, there are some things you need to know. About Lennox, about your marriage, about what's been happening in this house." I opened the folder Margaret had given me and placed the first document in front of him. Darren's face went pale as he read the headline about Richard Hartwell's restraining order. "Mom, where did you get this?" "From someone who cares about our family. Someone who's watched Lennox destroy other families and couldn't stand by silently anymore." I walked him through everything. The first marriage, the pattern of targeting vulnerable elderly relatives, the systematic isolation and financial abuse. With each piece of evidence, I watched my son's face change from confusion to disbelief to something approaching horror. "This can't be right," he whispered, staring at the hotel receipts. "Lennox wouldn't. She loves me. Does she, sweetheart? When was the last time she defended you to anyone? When was the last time she put your feelings before her own convenience?" Darren was quiet for a long moment, running his fingers through his hair the way he used to when he was struggling with homework. "But the business meetings? he started. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons at the Marriott aren't business meetings. Darren. They're affairs. Lennox has been using company money that's been coming from your father's trust fund, to pay for hotel rooms where she meets her lover. Trust fund? Darren looked up sharply. What trust fund? I took a deep breath. It was time for the final revelation. Harold set up the Montgomery Trust before he died. It's been funding Lennox's business for the past 2 years. Every dollar she thought was coming from anonymous investors was actually coming from your father's legacy. Money that's now under my control. Darren stared at me like I'd just told him I was secretly a spy. You've been funding Luminous Beauty? Unknowingly, until recently. Your father wanted to help you both succeed, but he also wanted you to feel independent. He never imagined that the beneficiaries of his generosity would treat his widow like an unwanted burden. I showed him the bank statements, the trust documents, the proof that every comfort they'd enjoyed had been built on Harold's money. Money that had stopped flowing the day after Lennox told me to eat in my room. The funding crisis they've been panicking about, I continued. That happened because I withdrew support. I got tired of financing people who couldn't show me basic respect in my own home. Darren's hands were shaking as he set down the papers. Mom, I had no idea. I swear I never knew about any of this. I know you didn't. But what you did know was how Lennox treated me, and you chose to allow it. You chose her comfort over my dignity, again and again. Just then, we heard Lennox's car in the driveway. Darren looked panicked. What do I do? How do I face her knowing all this? You don't have to do anything right now, just watch. Listen, pay attention to how she behaves when she thinks she's in control. Lennox burst through the front door, her voice carrying from the hallway. Darren, are you home? I have amazing news. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, practically glowing with excitement. Trevor found us new investors. Well, one major investor who wants to fund the entire expansion. We're meeting with him tomorrow to sign contracts. I watched my son's face as he processed what he was hearing. Trevor, the man Lennox had been having an affair with, was now supposedly finding investors for the business. The same business that was already being funded by money she'd never known about. That's great, Darren said carefully. Who is this investor? Someone Trevor's worked with before. Very private, very exclusive. He wants to remain anonymous, but he's willing to invest $200,000. $200,000, more than the trust had provided over 2 years. I found myself wondering where this mysterious money was really coming from, and what Lennox was promising in return. We'll finally be able to expand properly, Lennox continued, then noticed me sitting at the table. Her expression immediately hardened. Ramona, did you make a decision about co-signing that loan? Because if this other investor comes through, we might not need it. Actually, I said calmly, I did make a decision. I won't be co-signing any loans. Lennox's smile faltered. Why not? Because I don't think your business model is sustainable. What would you know about business models? Lennox snapped, her mask finally slipping completely. You've never worked a day in the corporate world. You don't understand the first thing about building a company. Darren cleared his throat. Actually, Lennox, Mom has been involved in your business more than you know. Something in his tone made Lennox go very still. What do you mean? Tell her, Mom, Darren said quietly. Tell her where the money really came from. I stood up slowly, enjoying the way Lennox's confident expression began to crumble. The Montgomery Trust has been funding Luminous Beauty since its inception. Every anonymous investor, every mysterious transfer, every dollar you thought came from strangers. It all came from my husband's estate. Money that I control. Lennox's face went white. That's impossible. Is it? You never wondered why legitimate investors suddenly lost interest when the funding stopped? You never questioned why no one could provide contact information for your previous backers? I opened another folder, this one containing copies of every transfer, every payment, every dollar that had flowed from the trust to her business. 2 years, Lennox. 2 years of building your dreams with my money while treating me like I was worthless. While having an affair with Trevor and using my money to pay for hotel rooms. Lennox's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Finally, she turned to Darren. "You can't believe this nonsense. She's a bitter old woman who's jealous of our success." But Darren was already standing up, the hotel receipts in his hand. "Is this nonsense too? These receipts for the Marriott? These charges to the business account for consulting fees that happened to coincide with your Tuesday and Thursday afternoon disappearances?" The fight went out of Lennox all at once. She sagged against the doorframe, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked her age. "I want you out," Darren said quietly. "Pack your things and leave, tonight." Lennox tried to argue, tried to explain, tried to manipulate him one last time, but the evidence was overwhelming, and Darren had finally seen through her performance. She left that evening with 2 suitcases and her car. No threats, no demands, no dramatic exit. Just the quiet defeat of someone whose game had finally been exposed. After she was gone, Darren and I sat in the kitchen again, the house feeling larger and lighter without her presence. "Mom," he said, "I owe you the biggest apology of my life." "You don't owe me an apology, sweetheart. You were manipulated by someone who's very skilled at manipulation. But I should have seen it. I should have protected you." I reached across the table and took his hand. "You were protecting your marriage. That's what good husbands do. You just didn't know you were married to someone who didn't deserve that protection." 3 months later, Darren moved back into his childhood bedroom while he sorted out the divorce and figured out his next steps. It wasn't the life either of us had planned, but it was honest in a way our lives hadn't been for years. I kept the Montgomery Trust, but I used it differently now. Smarter. Harold's money went toward causes that honored his memory: scholarships for young people, support for elderly people dealing with financial abuse, and a comfortable future for the son who'd found his way back to me. Lennox disappeared from our lives completely. I heard through Margaret that she'd moved to Florida and was already targeting a new family. I considered warning them, but I'd learned that some people only believe the truth when they discover it themselves. On quiet evenings, Darren and I would cook dinner together and eat at the dining room table, talking about our days like we used to when he was young. My voice was no longer irritating. My presence was no longer unwelcome. I'd found my power, and more importantly, I'd found my voice again, in my own home, at my own table, with my son who'd remembered how to see me as more than just an obstacle to navigate around. The empire Harold built was still mine, but now I ruled it wisely. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.